This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglan.
We know Kentucky today, but what about early Kentucky? I mean, early. We go inside outdoors with two experts who can read the artifacts and cultures of ancient era and past peoples like a book. And what they say speaks volumes. Many of the ways they live their lives are still present in how we live ours. From hunting to tools to teams at schools, the way it was is next on Kentucky Afield Radio.
Boys were in trouble. About 10 seconds later, he said boys were going down.
A true story.
And it sunk right out from under us.
20 degrees.
Within seconds, one boating trip went
straight down.
The water was bone chilling.
Once you hit that water, it's so cold you can't move.
The human body wasn't designed for this.
It took my breath away as soon as I hit it, and my hands were so cold in a matter of seconds that I couldn't pop the clip on my waders to get them off.
Conditions were so bad it's amazing that anybody survived.
Perfect for duck hunting, but not for a swim in the middle of a river.
Going overboard is never the thought.
You have to think ahead.
Fun can turn frantic in seconds.
There's no time to react when your world just sinks out from under you.
3 hunters, 2 survivors, 1 reason.
Your life jacket's got your back.
Make sure your first mate isn't your last.
I really don't think that I could have made it without a life jacket.
Your Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife reminds you, your life jacket's got your back, and the backing of sportsmen on winter water everywhere. Welcome to Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Charlie Baglan. Hey, old timer. Ever said that? Ever made some smart remark about someone's age? Age jokes aren't funny. And here we are, Kentuckians, a group of people who respect their elders. We revere their experience, the pathways they have blazed to make life today better. World War II vets, a noted example. Pioneers in sports, screen, stage, science. But what about the people who came before them? Their elders. You know your mother, your father, grandfather, a little older. Do you know your great-grandfather? Your image of your mother and your grandmother progress with age as we bring them to mind. Then, something odd starts to happen. The farther we go back in time, the younger people seem. Our ancestors stop being the aged of the family and become normal, real people with real families. Why? Because that's who they were. They came to Kentucky from lands far away with accents, beliefs, and traditions all in tow. Today, we go inside outdoors to take a look at who came before us, before Daniel Boone, back thousands of years to the first people who walked into this area of the continent and said, "Hey, I like this. I think I'll stay." Cultural anthropologist Tressa Brown from the Kentucky Heritage Commission. She'll be along in our second half hour. First up is author and archaeologist Gwynn Henderson from the University of Kentucky. And Gwynn, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How far back does your research really take us?
Well, the archaeological research that's been conducted in Kentucky for over a century, frankly, has documented that Native peoples, who are the ancestors of today's Native Americans, came to what we call the Commonwealth of Kentucky around 10,000 years ago, and they're still here today.
The end of the Ice Age.
The end of the Ice Age. People are traveling across the land bridge between Asia and North America. People are moving down into an area that is not populated. The Western Hemisphere is not populated at this time. Eventually, Native peoples came to what we think of now as the geographical location that we call Kentucky. They would have come from the west, and these hunting and gathering, migrating peoples would have been following the rivers into Kentucky and then following up smaller rivers and so forth. These folks are hunters and gatherers, and they are hunting, in many cases, these large megafauna, mastodons, mammoths, large sloths.
Hence Big Bone Lick State Resort Park.
Exactly. And in fact, fossils of these large animals have been found in other places in Kentucky, too. In the 70s, a farmer was clearing out a pond in Harrison County and encountered some strange-looking rocks, and along with one of the professors, a group of us went out, and it was like a baby mastodon, I think, and its tooth was, a couple of other bones were there. So it's not just big bone. There's no question that there were mammoths and mastodons and these other large megafauna in Kentucky. And so here's the deal, Charlie. When you come to a new place, and I don't care if you're a person who's moving to Kentucky for the first time in 2016, or if 10,000 years ago, you have to orient yourself on the landscape. And there are things that you learn about where the resources are. So that very first era of Kentucky history, when the glaciers are retreating and people are moving in, it's new to them. And so they are exploring and adapting to a new place. This would have taken many generations as they came down through what is now Alaska, then across the Great Plains, and then into the eastern United States.
If people liked to eat bison across the Great Plains, they would have been in hog heaven. But also, once you look out over Kansas and Nebraska, there's not a lot there. And I'm wondering if there was a lot there 10,000 years ago versus as we see it today of the farming community. But that would have made me say, I think I'll stay here in the Rockies. But for something pushed them on across.
The environment back then in Kentucky at that time, when those folks arrived, they arrived and saw a landscape that was more like what Canada looks like today. A parkland environment with nothing but evergreen trees, spruce, fir, that kind of stuff. Would have looked very strange to us if we were plopped down in Kentucky back then. It took several thousand years for the environment to adjust as the glaciers retreated, the temperatures warmed up. The kind of animals that we think of when we think of Kentucky today, deer, bear, elk, and turkey, they appeared. The plant regime that we're more familiar with developed. There were deciduous trees and that kind of thing. So I don't know what the high plains would have looked like back then.
But as far as Kentucky being compared to Canada, again, this was coming off of the Ice Age, and so it was cold here. In Canada, they have what's called the boreal forest, rich, hardy, evergreen trees. So that would have been here because that's what the climate called for.
That is exactly right.
At what point did people start leaving behind traces, documents, or artifacts that helped us really know what kind of life that they lived?
As an archaeologist who studies ancient indigenous culture through the places they lived and the objects they left behind, I see those as documents. I have learned how to read those as documents. And so the first documents that indicate human beings lived in Kentucky date back 10,000 years. They are not pieces of paper. They are chipped stone tools. As time goes on, those documents, those archaeological sites, campsites, hunting camps, geometrical enclosures, mounds, circular villages, all of these documents human habitation in Kentucky that's unbroken from 10,000 years ago up till now.
Back in 1992, you published the book Kentuckians Before Boone, and you talked about a group in there, Fort Ancient People, that lasted 700 or so years.
Our best guess is that these Fort Ancient farming peoples who lived in central and eastern Kentucky for 700 years, their farming way of life started around 1000 AD and then extended all the way up and overlaps with the appearance of Europeans in the Ohio Valley. But after about the late 1700s, folks had moved. And, of course, in the early 1800s, the Indian removal policy, Native peoples were forcibly removed.
I'm sorry that had to happen.
I am too. Native peoples are too, frankly. And in the Southwest, you have resident populations there. The Zuni are still there. The Hopi are still there. The Navajo are still there. And you have an opportunity to talk to people who have been in that place since time began or since humans arrived. In the Ohio Valley, the fabric of indigenous culture has been terribly impacted by removal.
Riveting conversation. Archaeologist Gwynn Henderson is my guest. We'll have more. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We are back on Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Charlie Baglan, talking about the old days. I mean, the really old days. Those who came before us and who came before them. My guest is Dr. Gwynn Henderson with the Kentucky Archaeological Survey. We're looking at various ways the words, the wisdom, the sense of adventure that well precede us are still alive today. We're answering some Kentucky questions and addressing a few myths. And one thing that I've long been curious about, what does the word Kentucky mean?
Some people will say it has something to do with the environment of Kentucky back when the first Europeans were arriving in this area. There was an awful lot of cane. We don't know what native language that word comes from, and it could have been, any number of languages because there were native peoples in the Ohio Valley that spoke an Algonquin language, that would be the Shawnee, an Iroquoian language, that would be the Cherokee, a Muskogean language, that would be the Chickasaw. I don't even know, which language family that name comes from. It does not mean dark and bloody ground. It does not mean land of promise and land of tomorrow. Those are terms that have come down through history linked to the misrepresentation of what Kentucky was like as the European settlers were coming to this area. I do know that the first time that the word appears in print was in the 1700s. These traders had been captured by the French and taken to Montreal, and they wrote a letter wanting to explain their situation and try to get out of prison. They explained that they had been trading in Kentucky. This mid-1700s is when the name appears in writing, but I don't know when that term actually began to be used in conversation.
So it is not the dark and bloody ground, is it? Is it the happy hunting ground?
No. All of these are terms that are linked to this perception that a lot of people carry that Native peoples never lived in Kentucky but only hunted here.
I've heard that myself, that they would hold Kentucky as a sacred place that they would come to hunt, and they would go back to wherever, Tennessee or Ohio. What's the true story in your findings?
The true story is Native peoples have lived in Kentucky for 10,000 years. They had villages. They lived here permanently. They were farmers. They were gardeners. They didn't look at the sun at about quarter till midnight and say, oh, we can't live here permanently, we can only hunt here and leave. For some reason, this idea that native peoples only hunted here, never lived here permanently, has persisted and continues, and what it does is it denies any connection between native peoples and native contributions to Kentucky history. It lops off the longest time of Kentucky history, which is before Europeans arrived. I'm not exactly sure why this myth persists, but it does. I can appreciate why people of native descent become very frustrated when they are told that native peoples never lived in Kentucky permanently, but only hunted here. For hundreds of generations, native peoples lived, worked, played, died, buried their dead, laughed, sang in what we call Kentucky.
Well, there's one thing that scientists love to point out is something called evidence. Point out some examples of what lets us know that we have always lived here.
All right. We have evidence of hunting and gathering folks from the 6000s and 5000 BC along the Ohio River outside of Louisville. Very deeply buried by multiple floods. Multiple layers, just like a layer cake. And multiple layers showed the stone spear points of native peoples, places where they had dug pits for food storage, had built their fires. Just outside of Lexington, there are a series of mounds, earthworks, where they lived, where they made their pottery, where they built sacred circles, and where they built burial mounds. And in particular, the Red River Gorge, the dry rock shelters in Red River Gorge, have produced charred plant remains of domesticated native plants, such that if anyone in the world is interested in exploring plant domestication, they will know about the rock shelters in Powell, Wolf, and Menifee counties, because some of the earliest dated domesticated goosefoot and sunflower seed remains have been recovered from these dry rock shelters.
These aren't exactly the pyramids or Stonehenge or Easter Island, but I would say these artifacts this evidence is just as valid, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I would. What's important for us to remember is, even though the materials from Kentucky, like you said, may not be as fantastic, they still are a record of people who lived long ago. And for some of these groups of people, it's the only evidence that they ever were on Earth.
The United States as a continent, the North American continent versus Europe as a continent, from what I'm gathering, Europe may have been a little farther along technically.
When native people made the atlatl, or spear thrower.
And that was our first hunting tool, right?
That was our first hunting tool. That's exactly right. The physics of that particular weapon system is as complex as any other physics that you would consider regarding other weapons systems. You have to know exactly which plants to use to create the cordage. You have to understand the aerodynamics of rifling, and when you put those fletching, usually feathers, on the back end of the projectile, it can go straight and true.
If we have sparked interest, where can people go to learn more?
If people want to know more about Kentucky's ancient native heritage, they can go to the web and look at the Kentucky Archaeological Survey's website. They can go to the Kentucky Heritage Council's website. They can go to the Kentucky Native American Heritage Commission's website. There are a number of books that are written for folks who are interested in this kind of thing that aren't deeply and boringly technical. There is a book that was published by the University Press of Kentucky called Kentucky Archaeology. If someone's interested in getting the evidence, understanding the diversity of native adaptations in Kentucky, then that's a really accessible and very readable resource. It's called Kentucky Archaeology.
And what about your book, Kentuckians Before Boone?
That is written based on archaeological research that was conducted in central and eastern Kentucky.
It's a fictional story based on your research.
Well,
correct?
My research and many other people's research in that time period, yes. The impact of writing that book has had long-lasting significance for my research as an archaeologist.
Where can we find the book today?
The book today, you can buy it from the University Press of Kentucky. They also have electronic version now, I think. If someone goes to the University Press of Kentucky's website and type in Kentuckians Before Boone, it is there.
Okay.
If teachers are interested in getting copies of it, they can get a discount.
Nice. It lets you learn a lot about who came before us right here in Kentucky. It's been fascinating to talk with you this past hour.
You know, everybody's interested in some aspect because almost everybody has found a spear point in a field. And they want to know who made it, why did they make it, how old is it, why is it there?
Little things like that get our curiosity.
Yes, they had the same curiosity that we have.
Mm-hmm.
How long ago, who made this, why is this here in our field? The connection between long ago and now.
Somebody's going to, they'll dig up an iPhone 10,000 years from now, and they'll wonder, what is this?
Exactly. I think humans, by nature, are curious, and it doesn't make any difference if you're an ancient native person living in Kentucky or someone living in Kentucky now. As humans, we're all interested in who we are, how did we get here, what are their stories.
Dr. Gwynn Henderson, Kentucky archaeologist. We are out of time, but ma'am, it has been enlightening.
Thanks so much for including me.
Culture, bunches of them have come together over the centuries to form our great state. In the next half hour, we are joined by the Kentucky Heritage Commission and anthropologist Tressa Brown as we move from several thousand years ago to just a few hundred years ago, what historians call yesterday. We'll see how it all applies, plus our fishing report is just ahead. You are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We are back in our second half hour, and if you would like to hear this show again or email the link to someone, it's easy to find. Just go to Facebook, and you can find our weekly links there. Also on YouTube, put Kentucky Afield Radio in the search box. We are also an iTunes podcast, and you can find us there. More with The Way We Were after our fishing report.
This is Jeff Crosby with the Central District Fishing Report. Two species of interest this time of year are sauger and trout. Sauger begins staging below many of our locks and dams on the Ohio and Kentucky rivers. Try live minnows or a variety of jig spoons or minnow-imitating lures to catch these fish. Please observe all boating regulations when fishing below these locks and dams due to dangerous water conditions and protect yourself from the cold weather conditions. Additionally, you may want to try your luck at catching a few trout at many of our area fishing and neighborhoods lakes, the FIDS program. Many of these lakes will be stocked with trout this month. These trout can be caught on a variety of lures such as night crawlers, redworms, or mealworms. So grab a pole and enjoy some good winter fishing. Hope to see you on the water.
In western Kentucky, down at Kentucky and Barkley Lakes, we've had some pretty good winter fishing, all because of the mild winter we've been having. A lot of people that I've talked to are catching their limits. When I ask them what color jig they're using, they indicate whatever color they drop down there, the crappie are biting it. Talking to a few bass fishermen, they've had a good winter fishery, again, because of the weather. The bass have been on secondary and main lake points, just fishing kind of slow, Alabama rigs. Below the tailwaters has been kind of off limits because of discharge. We had some rain, and so they've got gates open and spilling into the tailwaters. And so fishing the tailwaters has been kind of slow to off. So I would stay on the lakes. Crappie and bass is what we're talking about during the wintertime. This is Paul Reister, and I hope you find a good day to go fishing.
This is Eric Cummins with your Southwest Kentucky Fishing Report. Barren River Lake is back at winter pool, and bass are being taken on jerkbaits and jigs on wind-swept points. Crappie are being taken off channel drops near downed trees or structure with minnows and or jigs. At Green River Lake, it's also back at winter pool with bass being taken on jerkbaits, jigs, and swim baits, again on those wind-swept points, and also deeper shorelines. Look for spotted bass and smallmouth on sun-drenched banks and slides. Muskie also good on those wind-swept banks or near laydowns or brush with jerkbaits, swim baits, and lipless crankbaits. Fish for trout at our holdover trout streams like Trammell, Jennings, Sulphur Springs, and Roundstone for browns and rainbows. As always, good luck and good fishing. Be sure your life jacket's got your back.
Kentucky's Nature and Wildlife Fund. You see it as a contribution option when you prepare your state tax return. But you also see it as songbirds and wildflowers. You can see it in clear, flowing streams. Sometimes it's so secluded you may never see it at all. But if you only see it on your PC as you prepare your taxes, that's good too. Google it and see the difference this fund makes. Kentucky's Nature and Wildlife Fund, the natural tax shelter.
Hunting elk in Kentucky is a dream come true for many, and I want to add my name to that list.
And I want to add mine.
If you want to add yours,
the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife website is Elk Central. The Pick 4 option lets you put your name in the hat for cow, bull, archery, or firearm.
Plus youth tags.
The deadline is midnight, April 30th.
This could be my year.
And it could be yours.
Register for incredible Kentucky elk hunting at fw.ky.gov.
We are back on Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglan. You got your way. I got mine. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. It's the American way. We have coined several sayings over the years to justify what we do and maybe explain why. At the same time, it points out that there are several ways to do one thing. Cultures coming together from across the globe, from across time, to form present-day society is what my next guest understands very well. She is cultural anthropologist Tressa Brown with the Kentucky Heritage Commission. Tressa, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Let me start out by saying my sister was curious, and she asked me. I didn't know. I said, well, I'll ask you. The research I was able to do on these folks called them free people of color, the Melungeons. Who were the Melungeons?
There's a lot of debate about who the Melungeon people are. The folks in eastern Kentucky and along the Appalachian chain, I guess through oral histories, have connected themselves with this group of folks called Melungeon, which is a multiracial group of folks, which is African American, Native American, European, and some people are saying Portuguese.
Was it a very closed group that they would marry within themselves?
In a manner of speaking, I mean, it's geographically the area is a little bit isolated, so they would have not necessarily, within families, but certainly families along in the same walking distance or riding distance would marry, yeah.
This area, where was that?
Eastern Kentucky, like I said, along the Appalachian Mountains.
Would they go across over to West Virginia,
Sure.
Tennessee, that whole area?
I think so, because families would have settled there, and then they would socialize with the folks in the area, and then your rings of socialization would have overlapped, and you would have met people that way. So, yeah, they would have traveled. I don't think that the state lines mean that much to people when they're traveling across the mountains like that.
Probably not. What years were these, do you think, that the Melungeons would have existed in our state?
17 and 1800, certainly. It would have been after a good bit of European settlement was in the area. So, we're talking the mid-1700s on.
I had read where if you think that, let's say you're looking in the mirror and say, I think I have some, what I'm going to say, Indian in me, the Native American in me, and you try to trace it back to the Shawnee or whatever, you may be mistaken. You may be trying to find some Melungeon in you. Have you heard any of that?
Well, some folks believe with that multicultural that Native American is part of that. And a lot of people are misidentify themselves because of family stories often. I know that African American and Native American heritage gets mixed together frequently through history. And because of different social pressures, you either acknowledge one and try to divorce yourself from the other when you have them both.
It says here, according to my notes, olive-complected, dark-eyed, dark-skinned, living in Appalachia, Portuguese descent. I'd never heard Kentucky and Portugal used in the same sentence until now.
Yeah, I'm not really certain how that came about, but I know there was a lot, especially during the activity of coal camps in Kentucky and eastern Kentucky. There were a lot of European immigrants, Eastern European and just European immigrants that came to work in the coal camps. Now, whether Portuguese were part of that, I don't know, or if that was that certainly would have been an earlier time to connect with the Melungeons.
They were triracial. Do you suspect that any of their lineage is still present in Appalachia or eastern Kentucky?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, again, it's in a lot of the area in central Kentucky, actually across all of Kentucky, that there's a lot of people who still won't identify themselves as Native American. And so if they can, quote, pass as European or white, then they will, because for so many years there were social kind of stigmas attached to being either biracial or Native American, and that if you could pass as black, you would do that before you would identify as Native American.
Had a lot of people come before us, didn't we, Tressa?
Thousands and hundreds of thousands for thousands of years.
You had told me once on the phone that Kentucky recognizes, I don't know if they recognize the Melungeon people or not, or if there is no officially recognized Indian tribe.
There is not. Kentucky is one of the few states that have no state-recognized people, and there's no federally recognized tribes here either. Although there are almost 200 different tribes represented by individuals in the state itself does not recognize any tribes.
I thought it was interesting when you said, no, we don't recognize any tribes officially, but their lives, their influences, their music, their beliefs still live on and influence us today.
Absolutely, absolutely. You look in education in a lot of the professional fields in music and cultural traditions within the state, and it's everywhere. You almost can't divorce yourself from it. You're walking on it. Every time you pick up a projectile point from the field, that's part of the people that were here before us.
A projectile point, what I'd call arrowhead.
Yeah.
I've heard spear point also used.
Many of what people pick up is not actually an arrowhead. It's a spear point from an atlatl spear, because atlatls were used for, or spear throwers, were used for hundreds of years longer than the bow. So arrows would have been developed much, much later, and they're much smaller, and they look completely different, most of them. So a lot of times when you find a point, it's actually a spear point, not an arrowhead.
I had done a little cursory research on anthropology, and what I've learned in advance of you coming here today was incredible. If you were an anthropologist, if you study that at all, it's the study of cultures, correct? And how, not just how they develop individually, but how they fit together in society. Mm-hmm. You would have to be the best person to be a negotiator, to be in advertising, to be in public relations. You understand everybody's point of view, and you can find some commonality in that, right?
That's the goal. Most anthropologists will specialize in a particular field, in a particular geographic region, or a particular topic like architecture or music or botany. So anthropology really crosses almost every other field, or can cross and intersect every other field. So if you want somebody in international business, an anthropologist can help you make sure that you follow, or at least are aware of, the cultural traditions with what's polite and what's not, for instance, within a particular group of people.
Well, a lot of different types of people in this state. Do you see people differently as you walk down the street or mingle among them, say, at a state fair, that I would not?
Maybe. I'll see people and I think, well, that person looks like they're from West Africa, or that person looks Apache or Navajo, or, there are certain physical features that place people geographically through their countries of origin. Americans have a different way of carrying themselves, a different space between when they're standing in line. For instance, we have a big space. Europeans have a much smaller personal space. Some countries have no space, and that's very comfortable for them and makes us very uncomfortable. Yeah, I guess I notice things.
You don't dwell on it.
I don't dwell on it, no.
As far as traditions are concerned in this state, they are front and center a lot at holidays, Christmas, New Year's, birthdays. Do we see these traditions elsewhere? And let's take the world of nature and wildlife, hunting and fishing and the environment. What do you see there as far as anthropologically cool?
Anybody who hunts and is a conscientious hunter, in other words, somebody who wants to make sure that they don't make an animal suffer, that they utilize the materials that they're harvesting from the animal, whether that's just meat or the hide or the bone or whatever it is. And also the challenge that those hunters place upon themselves. I don't know how many times I've heard of hunters, they start out with a firearm to go hunting, and then they want to up the challenge for themselves. They don't go and hunt something different. They change something about how they're hunting. So then they start hunting with a crossbow or a compound bow, and then they go to a simple bow, and then they start making their own bows, and then they start making their own arrows. Some people think they're regressing. Technologically, some people think so. You build a bow and tell me if that's technologically less or more. But they're making sure that they understand what they're doing, even though many hunters may not acknowledge it, that there's a spiritualness connected with the process of hunting. They do certain things, they challenge themselves, and they're very honorable and respectful of whatever it is they're hunting.
That didn't just happen overnight. That seems to me what I had heard about with the Native Americans and how they felt about wildlife.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about American Indian culture, you have to say cultures, because there's not just one. There's hundreds, different religions, different language, different ways of doing things, different ways of thinking about animal life and your relationship to that, to the world in general, to the nature in general. The spirituality or the cultural traditions that get passed along from father to son, from mother to daughter. Today, it's the younger people that are pulling their parents back out into the field to do things instead of the other way around. It's the most basic thing to go for a walk in the woods and see what's around you and recognize your place in it.
It's always been a man thing. Or it was, I want to say, until maybe the last generation or so. Maybe I'm wrong. The woman's place was in any place but not in the woods, hunting the deer.
Certainly women were closer to the home because they had to take care of the home, they had to take care of the kids, they did all the cooking, they did all the gardening for the most part. So those activities did keep the women around the home. However, women were responsible for doing all the gathering, which means they were out in the woods. They may not have been hunting with bow and arrow or atlatl or snare, but they were certainly hunting plants and roots and berries and nuts and everything else that, in fact, sustained a good part of their family when the guys came back without anything. Culture, through the ages, changes. It changes to the new environment, whether that environment is geographic environment, whether it is social environment. You have to change.
The show is about those who came before us. We're back with our final few minutes. Stay with us on Kentucky Afield Radio. We're back on Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglan. Tressa Brown from the Kentucky Heritage Commission. People would say, hey, you go to the Salado Wildlife Education Center, don't you? I said, yeah, I'm there routinely. Can you get me an eagle feather? Can you get me an owl feather? Or I like hawks. Can you bring me a feather? I said, no, I can't. Mm-hmm. The Native American culture, they do interact with those feathers, but somebody like me, I can't.
When there were federal laws put into place to protect these species, all of the birds of prey and all the songbirds are protected under law, federal law. Native Americans have used birds of prey, the feathers, the parts of feet, whatever, of birds of prey for their religious purposes, for praying. When it became illegal to obtain and have these, basically they took it to the federal courts and the Native American Religious Freedom Act was passed so that now Native Americans have legal access to them. Other people don't because it's not part of their religion. Native people not having access to, say, eagle feathers is like Christians not having access to a Bible. Native people have access to that legally, where other people don't. I think that it's important for folks to know that Native people have always been in Kentucky and continue to make Kentucky their home. We have, like I said, nearly 200 different tribes that are represented by individuals in the state today, and that's an amazing amount of diversity. pick up a book and look at the food, for instance, and where it came from of the American diet. If it wasn't for American Indian people, both North and South, we wouldn't be eating those things.
Is corn among that?
Oh, yeah. Tomatoes, potatoes, most of the peppers. So you're talking none of the Italian food like we know it. No tomato sauce, no pizza, no French fries, no chocolate. There's so much that's based on originally American Indian food. It's just phenomenal.
How about fashion? How about music? How about
language?
Language.
There's lots of words we use every day. Moccasin, kayak, canoe, possum, raccoon, all these are Native American words. There are phrases that people use a lot, which perhaps people shouldn't use, like putting on your war paint. Racist phrases and language that people need to be aware is racist or stereotypical. We have become very sensitive to this type of language with regard to, say, African American culture. And we are not at all educated as to what is derogatory to American Indians. And we need to be. We need to educate ourselves. And that's one thing that the Commission does religiously. We work toward those goals of dispelling stereotypes and making sure that people understand kind of what the facts are.
Do you have situations such as we would hear with the NFL team, like the Washington Redskins? Does that come up on a local Kentucky level?
It does. It comes up when we have high schools or elementary schools that still have mascots that are the Indians or the Braves or the Chiefs, and there are plenty of them. I think, well, actually, there are maybe 9 or 10 high schools that have those types of mascots, but innumerable elementary schools. And they need to acknowledge what that means. And regardless of the fact that they say that we want to honor these people, it's not. You need to be more aware of what position that puts American Indians in that are students at those schools.
Don't things sort of change meanings, or the old meaning sort of gets lost and isn't applicable anymore?
I think to some degree, but if a group of people tells you that it's hurtful, that it's demeaning, you need to listen to that. It's a little bit hard to explain very quickly because people don't get it. They don't get. I'm trying to be respectful and honorable, and these people were pretty cool people, and they were great warriors, and we want to acknowledge that. It's like, but that's not what you're doing by making them a mascot.
Why not?
What is a mascot? I mean, Does
it not represent in costume?
There you go, in costume.
In costume.
This is the difference, is if you put it on, it's a costume. If an American Indian puts it on, it's regalia. It's them. They're not trying to look like anything other than what they are. If you put on a costume, you're trying to be something you're not, obviously.
So you'd have to have an all-Indian school to be able to pull this off effectively.
Yes, and there are American Indian schools whose mascots are the Indians or the whatevers, and that works. Because they are.
Okay, I see that now.
Yeah, I mean, okay, you don't have mascots that are something as derogatory as the Redskins. There are all kinds of derogatory terms that different ethnic groups have been called. And there are none of them anywhere else that are national teams. You need to put it side by side with something that's comparable. And people don't want to do that.
I keep saying Indians, Native Americans, but I've heard them both used basically interchangeably. Is that fair?
I typically do that because the communities that I work with, the individuals that I work with, use those terms. They use the term American Indian and they use the term Native American interchangeably. Some people prefer one over the other. Some people prefer First Nations. Some people prefer Amerind. Some people prefer to kind of skip that piece of it altogether and say what tribe they're from. Shawnee or Navajo or Lakota or whatever.
I would suspect that the Native American culture is still very present in the tools we use, if that's for hunting, fishing, or building a house. Can you give me some examples?
Well, I think that any culture created tools that were functional, like a hammer, or something that grinds, or something that drills holes, or something that projects like a bow, or, I mean, the atlatl it wasn't just created over here. They used it over in Europe and Africa, I think in Australia as well. So the early people created tools that work. Just because they're made out of steel and fiberglass now doesn't mean that they function any differently than one made out of ground stone and wood.
And I would imagine that a tomahawk is still a pretty good hatchet.
Oh, yeah.
I've got a question on here, Tressa. Is there a story out there that's being ignored?
Generally speaking, unless you have some really good teachers, and there are some really good ones out there, they start Kentucky history with Boone and Walker coming into the state to survey. They don't start the thousands of years prior to that. And I think that's a huge part of the story, that we're missing 10,000 years of history if you're starting in the 1700s. We're also missing the contemporary scene. A lot of American Indians in the state now. They are engaging in education and cultural events and social events. There are powwows all over the state. If you want to see Kentucky, that's part of it.
Tressa Brown with the Kentucky Heritage Commission, thanks for coming by and being our guest.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
We are out of time. This is Charlie Baglan inviting you to join us in a week, and we'll go inside outdoors again here on Kentucky Afield Radio.